Hello everyone, welcome to Amusia, the podcast for music nerds. I'm Tom, and I'm joined by Blake.
Hello.
Say
hello.
Hello, Blake.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm good. Right. Today's episode is called "What is Equal Temperament and Why Do We Use It?"
Okay.
I thought this would be a fun topic.
Yeah, no, interesting, because we all use that as musicians without realizing.
Yeah, essentially. That was going to be one of the first points. Almost all modern Western musicians use this system today.
Yes. I imagine actually a lot of other cultures end up inadvertently using this system simply because, it's the default on a lot of DAWs and keyboards and synthesizers and things. And I imagine instruments tune to this as well.
Yeah. Oh, so you mean people in other cultures using modern equipment?
Yes,
like
even if
Logic.
traditionally they weren't using these tuning systems. I think kind of Western tuning has sort of got its tendrils everywhere now.
Yeah, for better or worse, but we'll find out.
Yeah.
I have an opinion. I'll tell you what my opinion is right at the beginning. For
Okay.
better. There is debate over whether or not it is actually good. There was a point, I was going to raise it at the end, but as we brought it up, there's a book by, I've written a note here, Ross W. Duffin. He wrote a book called How Equal Temperament Ruined Harmony and Why You Should Care.
Okay, that's quite strong.
It is. I haven't read it. I would like to, but I haven't read it, just to be clear. So first of all, let's talk about what it is. So maybe people in the audience, they would have heard of it, or they might have heard sort of vague things, because this is how I sort of came to be aware of it. You hear people saying stuff like, oh, we're actually playing out of tune all the time, stuff like this.
Yeah.
And unless it's actually really laid out to you, it's not clear why, or, why we're out of tune and why we're just dealing with it in the first place.
Okay, so what's the relationship between what we're about to talk about and, for example, the different tuning systems for orchestras across Europe? The 440, 432. Is that related at all?
Oh, you mean having a different standard pitch?
Yes.
To you? No, it doesn't really have anything to do with that at all.
Okay.
It's not really connected. It might be connected only in one way, that certain, say like a Baroque ensemble, might be playing in a historical tuning system, so it would be in a different temperament and a different standard pitch. But that's the only way in which it is actually connected, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, so this is not necessarily where we start, but it's the relationship between each note in a scale.
Yeah, well, let's just get a few things out of the way before we begin, right? I'm going to assume people in the audience have basic music terminology down, because there's going to be a lot of new terms that basically keep snowballing towards the end, and I'm going to try and do my best to explain them. But if I have to explain all musical terminology along the way, we're going to be here all day, basically.
Sure.
So, right. And I'm going to try and keep mathematical terms to a minimum for everyone's benefit, including mine.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It's not my strength, to be honest. But we only really need to understand very basic mathematical things to understand the need for equal temperament and how it's actually achieved. If I can understand it, anyone can, because my maths is not good, okay?
Okay.
Well, first of all, I think just discussing the actual word temperament to describe a tuning system, some people might find that a little odd.
So I don't know why it's referred to that at all.
Well, tempering is used in metallurgy as a term, and you temper steel. You make it more malleable, more sort of elastic.
Okay.
And it's similar to that, really. Musical scales that, we build all of our music from, they have to be tempered. They have to be sort of tweaked, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just sort of where the word comes from. There are two things that someone will need to understand going in. about intervals, because obviously we build musical scales out of intervals. So you would have heard of things like major second, major third, minor sixth, all that stuff. The two things you need to know about intervals for the sake of this conversation is that, one, there is such a thing as a perfectly tuned interval. A platonic interval, if you will.
Oh, no, don't do this, Tom.
I'm copying you. You said that in the last episode.
Did I?
Yeah. And this has nothing to do with subjective tastes either. It's not, oh, I like this, so it's more in tune. Because whether or not it's more pleasing to you is subjective, but there is actually a kind of mathematical reasoning behind whether an interval is actually in tune or not. So that's the first thing you need to understand before we go on.
Okay.
The second thing is that these perfectly tuned intervals, they don't fit together. It's just mathematically impossible to fit all of these different intervals together.
What do you mean by fit together?
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Well, Western music and almost all music that we know about, with very few exceptions, maybe none as far as I'm aware, the musical system is based around the octave. We have different scales and they repeat after an octave. This is true for Western classical and even simple pentatonic music that you find around the world. It repeats after an octave. Humans experience octave equivalence, and we kind of base our music around that.
Which is interesting. And is that related to the Harmonic Series? I know we don't want to get into the Harmonic Series at the moment, but potentially could be.
It's hard to say exactly why we experience octave equivalence, just in case anybody's wondering exactly what that term means. It's how, if I play a C in the middle of the piano and then the next C, it has the same quality to it. The only way to really understand it is to just do it, to experience it. But I imagine any musician watching this, they know exactly what we mean by this. We do have to talk a little bit about the Harmonic Series, but we don't need to go too much into it. So you basically need to know that it exists to understand why we do this. So we have a perfectly tuned interval. So you talk about like a perfect fifth. One that is like absolutely in tune. You could call it a just interval, like a just fifth.
Okay. So they're synonyms, are they? Perfect and just?
Well, this is the first confusion to appear. Okay. Thank you for bringing it up. No, that was a legit thank you. So we talk about intervals as being perfect in a musical sense, like the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, perfect octave, perfect unison. Those are just the intervals that don't have major or minor versions, which differ by a semitone, like thirds and sixths and sevenths.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, but you haven't heard perfect octave, perfect unison?
I've heard perfect unison, but I did not. I didn't realize it related to major or minor. I mean,
well, it's things that don't, and also any perfect interval that you invert is still a perfect interval.
How do you mean?
So C to F is a perfect fourth, but F to C is a perfect fifth. And a unison.
Oh, okay.
Say you move down an octave, it becomes a perfect unison. And so say you increase a perfect fifth like C to G by a semitone, that's an augmented fifth. We don't use major or minor in reference to these intervals in particular.
Or sharp five.
Yeah, sharp five if you're more of a jazzy boy. Yeah. So when I was saying perfectly in tune, you could have a perfectly in tune major third, but I was also talking about perfect fifth and stuff. So that's why we need to basically say just intervals.
Okay. Yes, that makes sense, especially when I guess also to start, we are talking about the 8-note scale, aren't we? Or are we talking about the chromatic scale?
A bit of both. Well, there are some examples that will show both, yeah. Okay. So these just intervals that I was talking about, the ones that are like maximally in tune, this is the first example where terminology kind of snowballs. So listen to this sentence I've written down here.
Okay.
So just intervals are ones that conform to the intervals as found in the harmonic series, as they have the simplest frequency ratios and less beating. So we've got three different things that just popped up in this one description.
Yeah.
I'm trying very hard to make sure anybody watching this with no knowledge of this topic will be able to follow. That's the goal.
Okay, can you just repeat that again?
Yeah, just intervals
Yep.
are ones that conform to intervals as found in the harmonic series, and these have the simplest frequency ratios and they have less beating.
Okay.
And we're going to go through all of these different things. So the harmonic series, you don't need to know too much about it, just a little bit. We talked about this before on another episode, but we have musical sounds are generally what you call compound tones, ones that have multiple frequencies together.
Yep. All
See, this is
sine
another
waves.
problem. Yeah, except them. This is another problem because compound has like several definitions in music as well. Because you have compound intervals and compound rhythms.
Yeah.
So just forget about those for now, for your own benefit. So when I'm talking about a compound tone, it's just one that is made of multiple frequencies, as opposed to things like sine waves that have no harmonics or overtones.
Yeah.
There's not really any example of natural sine waves, but there are things which are very close, which I found out.
Well,
One
I
of
know.
them.
I know that. Sorry, I'm kind of ruining the theatrics.
No,
here.
go on.
I know. Like wine glasses are very close, aren't they? So if you like oscillating glasses, like the what was that instrument called? The one invented.
By Franklin.
Yes.
Benjamin Franklin,
Yes.
the glass harmonica.
Yeah, is that not quite sinusoidal?
That might be. That was actually not the example I was going to use. I was going to use the example of an animal. There is a bird called the black-capped chickadee, and
Okay.
apparently its call is almost a sine wave. It's not quite. It has some overtones to it, but almost nothing.
Okay, we need to add this in post because I really want to hear this.
For the sound. Okay, I'll try and find a clip and add it in. So what are you asking me?
What am I asking you? I was going to ask you about beating. You mentioned beating.
Okay. We'll get to beating in a minute. Let me just crack on first.
Okay, sure.
Okay, we're talking about the harmonic series right now, so just to clear that up. So it's most easy to imagine in the case of a vibrating string, like say on a guitar or something,
Okay.
because it vibrates along its whole length, but it also vibrates in divisions. It's like a very complex set of jiggling. It's probably the best way to understand it.
Okay.
Yeah. Like you can imagine people with a skipping rope and it being like manipulated at different points, and you get these different patterns that appear.
Standing notes, right?
Yes, yeah, you get those, and you create those when you play harmonics on a guitar or a violin.
And these are just
Which is why
simply areas that don't oscillate up and down.
Yeah, so when you hold the like the midpoint of a string on a guitar or a violin, you create this node so it doesn't vibrate along its whole length, which is why the fundamental note drops out. What you really need to know about the harmonic series, it doesn't just apply to strings, it's all musical sounds. It's just most easy to imagine with a string. Like, it's the same sort of principles with a vibrating column of air, but trying to actually imagine these principles on an intangible, invisible thing.
Yeah, and also in different number of dimensions. I mean, I'm sure guitars do move in 3 dimensions, but it's easier to imagine the string is vibrating in 2 rather than a 3-dimensional column of air propagating out through a tube.
Yeah, it is the same principles, but you don't want to learn about it from that.
No.
Yeah, and these overtones, well, I think the difference between an overtone and a harmonic is that any sound that has other frequencies above it, these will be overtones. But the overtones that are part of the harmonic series, you can call these harmonics.
Okay.
And these all appear at integer multiples of the fundamental.
Yeah. So do you remember the order off the top of your head?
Yeah, well, integers just so whole numbers. So say your bottom string, the lowest pitch, the fundamental, say that's vibrating 100 times a second. You call that 100 hertz. It's all multiples of this. So the first harmonic, which you actually call the second partial, like the fundamental is the first partial, and then the second partial would be 200 hertz, and the third partial would be 300, the fourth partial 400, and so on.
Okay. So these are all. Is this linear?
No.
I'm just wondering. It's only because I know that often in tuning and octaves and everything, it's logarithmic, isn't it? Or at least it's non-linear.
Yeah, because one octave is not the same distance in frequency from another, because it doubles every time. To go up an octave is to double your frequency, which is why the second partial is an octave higher. Yeah. So where were we? So talking about the harmonic series. Oh yeah, the other point I made was that musical intervals, they have these frequency ratios, right? Because we can talk about pitch numerically, as in number of vibrations per second. You can describe two different pitches at a ratio. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Okay, yeah. Now I'd like to hear an example.
Okay, well, say I'm playing a string. I pluck a string, and it's vibrating 100 times a second, and someone else plucks one, and it's an octave higher, so it's 200 hertz. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. That's an octave has the simplest ratio of any interval. It's just a perfect double.
So
Which is probably why we experience octave equivalence, because it's the way it's perceived. It's just these vibrations are just perfectly syncing up every two vibrations. If that makes sense.
yeah, so that there's for every 2 cycles, there's 1 cycle of the other.
Exactly. And a perfect fifth, a just fifth,
Yeah.
will have a frequency ratio of 3/2, which is actually the third partial. So say in our example of 100 hertz, the third partial will be 300 hertz, which is a perfect fifth plus an octave from the fundamental, but it's a perfect fifth away from the second partial.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So
say our bottom note was C, we pluck the C, the second partial will be C an octave higher, and the third partial will be the G above that. So the C to G there, that's your perfect fifth. Or a perfect fifth plus an octave.
yeah.
Even if you plus an octave to an interval, the relationship stays the same. You just expand the distance.
Yeah. Okay, that does make sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Major-
so you've got, for example, you start with the first partial, you have 2-to-1. The second is 3-to-1. The fourth.
The third
is,
partial is 3-to-1.
Yeah, sorry.
The second harmonic is 3-to-1.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct. The
Okay.
synonyms
I know
for
it's
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the fourth partial.
Mm-hmm.
What is the ratio?
Well, the fourth partial is double the second partial, which is double the first. So it's an octave again.
Okay.
So it would be C, C, G, C again.
Yeah.
And if you imagine the relationship between those two partials, you have G to C, a perfect fourth,
Yes.
right? And the relationship there is 3-to-4. So that's what a just fourth would be. If you were building it from these principles.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And a major third, it's important to understand the major third because I'm going to use this as an example in a minute. This has a frequency ratio of 5/4. So, and also it's the fifth partial. If that makes sense. Because as we said a minute ago, 400 hertz, the fourth partial, is the same as the fundamental because there's octave at 200, double at 400, so it would be C again if
Yeah.
C was our low note. C is not 100 hertz, but it's easier using C major and very simple numbers. Okay, just want to make that clear. I'm just using this for the sake of clarity
Yeah.
by saying things wrong.
C is objectively the best key, and I will go on record
Okay,
with that
that's
statement.
you can die on that hill on your own. Um, yeah, so the fifth partial would be E. It would be a just E, forming a just major third with the fourth partial. So
Okay.
that has a 5/4 ratio. So say I'm playing a note at 400 hertz and you play one at 500, you'll be playing a just major third.
Okay. So,
Okay?
already we have the fifth, the fourth, the third, and the
Yeah,
octave.
the first first six intervals are just a major triad, basically.
Interesting. I mean, this does, and we won't
From
get
the
onto it
fundamental.
now, but it does have some interesting implications for why scales might be based in physics and not entirely constructed.
Yeah, well, no, it's exactly right. And many people argued against equal temperament because it doesn't build the scale on these properties, on these pure just intervals. But we'll get to that in a minute. And we talked about beating, didn't we?
Yeah.
Beating is an interference pattern that is produced by notes that don't quite match up,
Yeah.
basically.
So this is one of
go
those
on.
things that's super difficult to explain the kind of aural. What's the word I'm looking for? The experience, the qualia. I can't think of a good way of explaining this. What it's like to
No.
experience that. It's very difficult to say, other
Yeah.
than you just kind of know when something is beating and when it's not beating.
Yeah. Well, whilst you're groping for synonyms, I realised I was meant to bring in my guitar because I was just going to demonstrate what beating is. So
I mean,
we're
we
gonna
could
do
take a brief pause if you want.
No, we'll do this and then we'll wrap up this first half.
Okay.
So we're going to do a nice quick cut, and I'll have my guitar on me. Wait there. Right, and we're back, and I have a guitar on me magically. You didn't even see it, did you?
That was
It's just
incredible. Yeah.
smooth transition there. Yeah, so musicians use the phenomenon of beating to tune their instruments because it's so clear when something is not in tune. As I was saying, it's an interference pattern, and yeah, we'll just demonstrate it. So here's the E string, and here's the A string, and I can, as we were talking about the harmonic series and demonstrating it, you see this exact midpoint of the string is where I find the octave, and then because that's a 2-to-1, and then we talked about the 3-to-1.
Yeah.
So the third partial, I find that here. So that's a just fifth plus an octave higher than the lower string.
Okay. So.
And also
I
and I can find it at different points because it's there, but it's also a third from here.
So this is directly applicable to playing guitar.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then as we talked about, the fourth partial was the same as the fundamental, but 2 octaves higher. I find it here. So that's like a quarter of the string. That makes sense.
Yeah. No.
And
So
and I find it here, just over the sound hole as well.
so this is not
Okay.
going to be in tune. I mean, the octaves will be in tune, but the harmonics will be out of tune with the rest of the guitar.
Ever so slightly. Well, this is the thing with equal temperament. It's a lot of the key notes are actually like quite in tune. Like the fifth, it's very, very close to a just fifth. But we're going to get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But then also I get the major third there. You can hear that nice and clearly, I
Yeah.
hope. So I can just create a major triad out of these harmonics.
Nice.
So as we said, yeah. So, yeah. What was I getting at? Okay. So the third partial,
Yeah.
the third harmonic, no, the second harmonic. I confuse myself.
That's it, yeah.
Will be this high E, right?
Okay.
2 octaves higher than the low string, which is the same as the harmonic here, the second harmonic on the A string. So one of the reasons this is useful for tuning guitar especially is because if I want to compare notes and I'm fretting them, the moment I take my finger off to tune, I stop playing it.
Yeah.
So harmonics keep ringing, which is one of the reasons it's so useful. But this is so we can hear what beating sounds like. You should hear a very audible, like, wah, 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 sort of sound.
Wow. Yeah.
Can you hear that?
That's incredibly clear. Yeah, it sounds like like an LFO.
Yeah, and you can hear it speed up. And then, so this is why it's so useful, because I can just keep adjusting it until the vibration has stopped and we have a nice, pure sound with no beating. So let's listen as we get the E string back in tune. Hear that?
Yeah.
You could hear the beating slowing down.
So this is, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is them falling basically slightly out of phase because they're kind of detuned from each other. One is happening, completing its cycle slightly quicker than the other, and they're sort of slipping out and moving over time.
Yeah. It creates an interference, basically. But also, this is another point to raise. The beating will occur with two notes that are out of tune, not just with each other, but also at their shared partials.
Okay, you say that again.
So let's use the example of C and G again, okay?
Yeah.
And I want to get them nice and in tune. Let's say I want a piano and I want them in tune. The low C, that has G as its third partial, and it's the same octave as the G second partial, the G the octave higher. So they share partials at the C at the third partial and the G at the second partial.
Yeah.
They're meant to be the exact same frequency. So if they're out of tune, you get beating at these shared partials and at all multiples of these as well. So the sixth partial and the fourth, I think, as well. I'm going to have to double check that. But I think that's right.
Yeah, no, so that does make sense.
So you get an interference pattern with fundamentals and shared partials between the notes. So the dissonance has this very real quality to it. That's why I was talking about an interval being perfectly in tune, one that is perfectly pure. It doesn't have beating.
But it's going to, isn't it? If with the different tuning systems, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but that's incredibly interesting.
So equal temperament uses intervals that are not perfectly in tune. Should we end? We'll end this episode with an example, because I made some audio examples of different intervals created in two different ways. I was in Logic and I used the test oscillator thing to create a sine wave, and you can specify the exact frequencies.
Okay.
So starting with A440, which is just standard concert A now, generally, obviously there'll be exceptions, created a couple of different intervals. So you can actually hear what we're talking about. So I'm going to play the equal tempered fifth. These are very close to being perfectly in tune, but you can, if you really listen, there is a very slight kind of throbbing quality to it. Not quite pure, but so close that most people can't even tell. So let's have a listen to this.
Okay, yeah, so, okay, that I didn't hear.
Can you hear there's like, let's...
There's a slight busyness, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to. But then now let's listen to a just fifth, okay, for comparison. If you listen to them back to back quite quickly, you can hear that the equal tempered one has a very, very slightly more busy sort of quality to it. This is one of the good things about equal temperament is that they're actually remarkably close.
Yeah, there's not much in it.
So now let's listen to a major third for contrast, okay? And we're going to get more into exactly how these are built coming up. But let's just listen to this, for example. So listen to an ET major third. Okay. And now if we listen to a just major third, it just has a slightly more pure quality to it, slightly less busy.
Yeah, that one's way more noticeable.
Yeah, and now to wrap this up. By the way, when I've been saying ET, that is short for equal temperament. I meant to make that clear earlier, that I was just going to save time by calling it ET. Just in case you couldn't work that out. I'm sure you could. Now let's listen to an equal tempered A major chord. Okay, so you can hear how this sounds.
Oh, that's noticeable.
Yeah. Yeah, it is more noticeable. And then listen to the just tuned A major chord.
That's incredible.
Yeah. It's noticeable back to back, but the equal tempo ones are so close to being in tune you don't really notice most of the time.
Yeah.
Okay, should we wrap up this half and then carry on?
Sure.
Oh, cool. Right. See you all soon.
Goodbye. Bye.